BookSoup, and Alta Journal, I want to welcome you tonight for our program with Lambda Literary. Tonight we host Amy Spalding, Abdi Nazemian, Lee Wind, and James Brandon in conversation around the theme, the importance of queer history in YA literature. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that the books are available at the front register for purchase, and we'll be doing a signing following the program here in the event space. But I have a few bios for everyone, just so we know. James Brandon produced and played the central role of Joshua in the international tour of Terrence McNally's Corpus Christi for a decade, and is co-director of the documentary film based on their journey. He's the co-founder of the I Am Love campaign and serves on the Powwow Steering Committee for Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits in San Francisco. A contributing writer for Huffington Post, Believe Out Loud, and Spirituality and Health magazine, you may also recognize his first novel, Ziggy, Stardust and Me. Abdi Nazemian is the author of Like a Love Story and The Authentics. His novel, The Walk-In Closet, won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBT debut fiction. Not to mention that his screenwriting credits include such films as The Artist's Wife and The Quiet, as well as the television series The Village and Almost Family. He has been an executive producer and associate producer on numerous films, including Call Me By Your Name, Little Woods, and The House of Tomorrow. We're always happy to have him join us here at BookSoup. Lee Wind, author of Queer as a $5 Bill, joins us tonight as well. His award-winning novel was inspired by the real historical letters between Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Fry Speed. Crowdfunded, this book was Publishers Weekly's September 2018 Indie Success Story. And Amy Spalding manages the digital media team for an indie film advertising agency and writes and performs as often as she can. She is the author of several young adult novels, including Kissing Ted Callahan and Other Guys, and The Summer of Jordi Perez and The Best Burger in Los Angeles, which earned a starred review from Kirkus and was named a Best Book of 2018 by NPR, the Boston Globe, Cosmopolitan, and more. Her next book, We Used to Be Friends, publishes in January 2020. Moderated by author Amy Spalding, tonight you join us for a roundtable discussion with authors James Brandon, Abdi Nazemian, and Lee Wind about why writing queer history in the young adult canon is not only an important aspect to the popular genre, but a necessity in documenting our history for young people today. We are absolutely honored to host these guests tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Those were great bios of all of us. How is, if you guys don't mind, just go down and a short intro on what your book's about, and then we'll get into what I hope is a lively discussion.
Excellent. You want me to start?
Yeah.
Sure. My book, Ziggy, Stardust and Me, is set in St. Louis in 1973, when homosexuality was still classified as a mental illness and a crime. And it's about two boys, one boy who's fighting that illness and being treated for it, and he meets another boy who comes into his life and changes it forever, and it's about these two boys who fall in love in a world that won't let them.
My book is called Like a Love Story. It takes place in New York City in 1989 and 1990. It's about three teenagers at the height of the US AIDS epidemic. The story kind of begins when Reza, an Iranian teenager, moves to New York City with his mother and is very deeply in the closet, and so he starts dating a fabulous aspiring fashion designer named Judy. But as their relationship develops, he starts to fall in love with her gay best friend Art, and an added element of it is that Judy's uncle is an ACT UP activist living with AIDS, and he becomes a mentor figure to all three teens. So it's really a story about three teenagers finding love, but also finding a sense of community and activism.
That was great.
Please read it.
Just stop and read.
So Queer as a $5 Bill is my book. It was basically inspired by a talk I went to where in 2011, Randy Harrison, not the actor from Queer as Folk, but a different Randy Harrison, gave a talk, and he was talking about the letters that Abraham Lincoln wrote Joshua Fry Speed. And he was convinced that Abraham loved Joshua. And I am gay and I didn't come out until my 20s, and I spent a lot of time in my teen years and in my early 20s dating girls and always judging it that it was the right thing to do but not feeling it. And I when I heard this thing about Abraham and Joshua, I went to the library and I got out the letters and I read, and there was this one letter where Abraham writes Joshua and he says, you know, you've now been married to this woman for 8 months. Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad that you're married as you are? And I just got goosebumps, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I felt. And I just, the more I read, the more research I did, the more convinced I became that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I only had a time machine and could go back and tell my 11-year-old self that, it would have changed my whole life. And I thought, well, I don't have a time machine, but I can write a book. So this book is my time machine. It's basically about a 15-year-old closeted kid who lives in Lincolnville, Oregon, a town I made up, a really conservative town, and he is closeted from everybody, but he discovers this thing about Lincoln. He gets the letters, he reads them, he has the exact same experience I did, the same goosebumps that I got, I gave him, and he decides that he's going to out Lincoln to change the whole world. And it goes viral, and it ends up sparking a huge conservative backlash and media firestorm, and he has to kind of make his way through, and they bring in a civil rights attorney to help them because things are going so badly. And she has an openly gay son, and sparks fly between the two boys. But the main character, Wyatt, can't do anything about it because a gay kid saying Lincoln's gay is going to just be dismissed. So he has to decide, is he going to try to change the world, or is he going to try to follow his heart and see if something might happen with this other guy? So that's Queer as a $5 bill.
Sounds amazing.
And if for some reason you're like sitting watching this panel, but also like history, who cares? My book, Summer of Jordi Perez, and the best brother in Los Angeles, is set in the here and now, and the actual here and now, because it's set in Los Angeles. It is a teen lesbian rom-com about first jobs, first love, and finding the best burger in Los Angeles. So anyway, we'll not talk about that much, unless I feel like it.
Absolutely.
So these are all stories are very specific, but I think anytime you get into the historical realm, getting really specific, it's a time and a place, it might be certain actual historical figures you're talking about. So what about these time periods, these people, what inspired you to want to tell this story now?
I'll start. Thank you.
You guys are
You
so
inhaled
polite.
loud.
Yeah.
Everyone's like,
Give
what
us a
about
few
you?
minutes. Give us a few minutes.
I
I
know,
thought
right.
we were in
We've
Los
only just
Angeles.
started, yeah.
Where's the fighting?
For me, I was brought many years ago. A friend of mine brought me an episode of This American Life titled 81 Words, and it was about this time in history when homosexuality was still classified as a mental illness, but on December 15th, 1973, the APA officially declassified it as a mental illness. And this episode is all about these two factions, the Gay Liberation Front and the APA, fighting each other on, you know, the APA is saying, no, this is what we know is true, and we're trying to help these people. And the Gay Liberation Front's obviously saying, no, this is barbaric what you're doing to people, and we are normal and healthy, and, you know, take this away from the DSM, the big book of mental illnesses. And I knew nothing about this time. And it was, for me, it was the first wake-up call that I had, that I realized I know nothing about my own history, and because it's not taught at all. I certainly did not grow up learning anything about it. It's only till recently in California that it was passed in 2011, and they're still trying to implement that in textbooks and high school curriculum here. So for me, that was the inspiration. I realized how little I know about my history and how important it is that we do know our history, because especially at a young time when you're young and you're questioning and feeling lost and confused, when you see yourself represented in books and history, you feel more connected, you feel a sense of belonging. That's incredibly important to instill at that age. So for me, that was the inspiration to make a story about that, but to also allow young people more understanding of where queer peoples have come from and what we had to go through at that time. Not we, I wasn't alive then, but what people at that time had to go through to actually survive. And I interviewed many people who went through the treatments I discuss within the book, and they're still feeling the side effects of those treatments some 40 odd years later. I mean, what happened then caused irreparable damage, and it's important that we acknowledge that and talk about it.
And I just want to jump in on the heels of that and reinforce it. History is still being taught that it's the stories of rich, white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied men from Europe. And my daughter is in 11th grade now, and you know, I look at her history textbook and I just want to fling it against the wall because it doesn't include any of these stories of underrepresented people. So when I learned this thing about Abraham and Joshua, it was like this crack in this facade of history. And I was like, wait a minute, there's some light coming through. And then I started to dig deeper, and I was like, all these other stories about Mahatma Gandhi and his relationship with Herman Kallenbach, and Eleanor Roosevelt and her relationship with Lorena Hickok. And the more I kind of dug into it and started reading the primary source materials, the more excited I got. And I thought, oh my gosh, like this whole facade is going to come crumbling down, and we can let all this amazing rainbow light of history shine through, but we have to just get that first story out there, that first chink in that armor, and then suddenly it's revealed that it's all BS, and that there are women and people of color and disabled people and men who love men and women who love women and people who lived outside gender boundaries in history that made a really big impact. And the big turning point for me was realizing, it was when I was reading the letters that Gandhi wrote to Herman Kallenbach, and there are hundreds of the letters that are in public domain at this point. They're all been published on the internet. And I was reading just the letters between the two of them, and I was about like 120 letters in. And Herman Kallenbach was this German Jewish architect who lived in South Africa, and Gandhi and him, Joseph Lelyveld wrote a biography of Gandhi, and he called it Great Soul. And in the book, he had 2 pages that talked about the relationship that Gandhi had with Herman, and he said that Herman was Gandhi's soulmate. And because of that, the book was banned in one of the states of India, and in fact, that's how it ended up in the New York Times, which is how I found out about it. But the crazy thing is that if Gandhi was in love with this German Jewish architect, maybe that gives us insight into why he had that insight about that line, like, it doesn't matter if you pray facing left and I pray facing right, we're all praying to the same God. That was like a huge breakthrough, and maybe it wasn't he was great despite him being in love with another guy, but maybe it was something, maybe because he was in love with another guy. Like Eleanor Roosevelt too, right? Like she had the relationship with Lorena Hickok, and yeah, she was the first lady and she was married to the president, but she had this romantic relationship with this other woman, and she was the one that went and did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN. So suddenly it all starts to, like, history opens up like a flower when we start to hear our stories, and I think that's really exciting and very empowering, and that's really what I want young people to know.
Yes, Jesus, I don't know how to follow that.
That's a hard one to follow.
I mean, I guess
Covers
for
it
me,
all.
I agree with all of that, and I mean,
Yeah.
one of the conceits of my book is that the uncle character is writing note cards that he passes down to the teenagers that kind of chronicle queer history and queer culture. So obviously, like, I actually embedded the passing down of history in the book because it was so important, and so much of the book is about the importance of learning the history, passing down the history, teaching it, not letting it go away. I mean, I guess for me, in terms of the original question, like, I really wanted to write, after having written a couple of books and, you know, working in film and TV for a long time, I felt ready to write something that was just as personal as I could make it, you know? And I felt like to do that, I would have to write about the time when I grew up and the time when I was young. And so I felt like, you know, for me, always the most, you know, when I think about my youth and growing up, the most formative kind of event of it was the AIDS epidemic. It really, like, formed who I was in almost every way. I mean, I don't remember a world without it. When I realized that I was gay, it was at its worst. It really kind of just, you know, so much of it, you know, levels of, in the beginning, it's like the fear and the shame, which the book really delves into, but then it's also the sense of community, the way the queer community came together to you know, fight for better treatment, to care for each other. That then became like a formative part of my youth. So I always felt like to write a book about what it was like to grow up, not on the front lines of the AIDS epidemic, but to grow up as a young kid when it was happening, was a story I hadn't seen really. And that's really what drew me to that era of 1989 and 1990. And, you know, I just, the book is fiction, but as much as I could, it's like I did, you know, move to New York at a young age. I was Iranian. I was kind of dealing with both being an immigrant and realizing I was queer.
I assume you're also hanging out Madonna posters in your
Yes.
bedroom.
Oh, no, I had a Madonna
Sure.
room.
Oh yeah, it's
I don't
shrine.
when we moved to the United States, I was 10, and we had a little room that was like the suitcase room, I guess. It was like a closet, really. I don't know, we called it a room, but it was really more of a closet. And I took all the suitcases and I moved them into this like basement we had, and it turned into the Madonna room, which it remained. And I don't have a single photo of the Madonna, which drives me crazy.
It is really a sad thing that we didn't have, digital photography then.
Yeah.
No one
I
was
have-
chronicling
so much
our
has
lives.
been
And
lost.
I was very, I still am vain. And so like I would be like, ugly, and like throw it away. And it's just like such a little
know.
record of my
Totally.
own youth.
Me
Yeah.
too, and our parents weren't like now. I have kids. I take like literally my iPhone. It's just hundreds of
yeah.
pictures.
Yeah, but maybe the power of having that as a memory.
I know, but
I
I
would
want.
It's
but I
easier
really
to
want to see that
describe it.
suitcase
want a
room.
picture of
All
the
right,
Madonna
okay,
room.
all right, that's what
I
we
like literally want to go back and be like, because I would describe it to people, and it's like I can't.
like
Yeah.
a virgin.
But
That's
yes,
so
you're
cool,
right. It was
though.
fantastic.
Yeah.
It was 19 around like that same exact time.
Yeah.
Peak Madonna.
Well,
Long
and
ambition.
what I loved about your book too is like, yes, it's like fictionalized, but you took us into some act up protests, which was really,
Yeah.
really fun. I mean, it was intense, but
Yeah.
it was really interesting to feel like you were really involved with something that,
Right.
you only kind of read about. I'm speaking for myself. I read about these things happening,
Yeah.
but to actually be involved with it I thought it was such an awesome part of the
Thank you.
book, for sure.
Thank
It's
you.
like you felt really involved with it.
And
I think that's
I
important
took a
way to
lot of
teach.
care, and I did take a lot of care to research those protests as
Right.
much as I was very
Yeah.
diligent about, I was inserting fictional characters into it, but not
Right.
changing the history.
Right,
Everything
exactly. And
happens
you
on
could
the
feel
day that I say it happens.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
happened
yeah.
the way. I don't change who led it.
Yeah.
I don't, but it was tricky.
Yeah, of
It's hard
course.
when you're writing about people you admire.
Yeah, and actual events happening
Yeah.
too. I mean, you want to respect it, but you also.
Well, that's an interesting thing about writing history. I think for all of us, probably when you're writing history.
And it's one reason I'm
you're-
glad I don't. Because
Right.
I'm like, I don't have to line anything up.
But you have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
responsibility.
Yeah.
I think when you're writing history, you have a real responsibility because people actually lived
Yeah.
these histories.
But also there's a fear
Yeah.
now just through social media of being attacked for one tiny fracture that isn't the 100% factual truth, which
Yes.
is an impossibility almost because it's from
Yeah.
someone's perspective.
And we all know
Right.
too, like, I can be reading a book and I try not to be a jerk about such things because I'm a writer and I know
Right.
it's hard.
Right.
But if
Yeah.
you see something that's like blatantly wrong,
Right.
like all these books written by people who do not live in Los Angeles, and they're
Right.
like, I was driving south toward the mountains, and I was like, the
That
mountains
doesn't
are right
happen.
from there.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
mean, who cares? But I'm out of the book, and so like
Yeah.
I don't want to insert something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure and that's just writing about like a sense of direction and place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas you are covering actual historical events. If
Yeah.
you get that wrong,
Yes.
you know some person who lived there and it's like, wow, I was going to like this
Yeah.
book, but
Yeah.
this was July, not August.
Yeah.
I was so concerned that people were going to say that I made up the history in the book that I
Yeah.
actually, every direct quote by Lincoln, I printed it in
wow!
bold
Look at that.
for the whole book. And then there's an entire endnote section because I want people to know that I didn't make up anything.
I did.
And
Yeah.
that it's all real.
I did a very detailed author's note too.
Yeah. See.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I will say you have to take some liberty. I mean, I took like the biggest
Definitely.
liberty I took, but which is minor to me. But by the way, someone pointed it out.
Of course
is
they
I
did.
changed the date. The characters go to the Blonde Image. They're the big set piece of the Blonde Image tour.
How dare
Did you go
you.
to the Blonde
No,
Image
no.
tour? They always
But they
say, but
called
I
you out on
changed
it.
the date. No, they called me literally. There was a Blonde Image tour close to one of the NIH protests that ACT UP did,
Oh.
but I had to change the date by like 2 weeks, I think, in order to make it believable that they
Wow.
could do both in the period of time. And one of the very first people who read it was like, that's not when that Blonde Ambition date was. And I'm like,
So intense.
how?
Yeah.
How did you know that?
Yeah, I have
I
a,
Of
love
all
it,
the
though.
I
minor
have
liberties
a-
one could take.
I have
Yeah.
a date I fudged in my upcoming book because college admissions and a fight some people had did not work out with when they'd be finding out.
Yeah.
And so my editor and I had a long talk, and we were finally just like, you know what? We can't change it. We would have to rip the entire book apart over a date
Yeah.
that, by the way, by the time the book comes out next year, could change again.
Right.
Yeah.
So we just were like, let's
Yeah.
just leave it. But like, I know I'm gonna get somebody like, wow, I applied to this college, and
Well, and it's funny too. I mean, this is talking about super minor. One of there is a part where my protagonist is watching the Sonny and Cher comedy hour, and I have the date listed as Tuesday, but it was actually on a Thursday that it aired, and someone actually wrote me, he's like, No, we watch those on Thursday
Yeah.
night. I mean, and it's super intense, and I love it. Like, I love that people get so
I
intense
love that
with
people
it.
know this stuff,
Artistic.
honestly. I
Me
think
too.
it's great.
But
I
isn't
do
it
too.
isn't it cool that somebody's reading it that carefully?
Right,
Yes.
that's what I
They're
mean.
so invested in this
And that
story.
they're like, gotta let you know. FYI.
Yeah.
Did you have people letting you know about their experiences with Abraham Lincoln?
Not yet. No tell-alls yet.
Yeah.
There, you know what? That is
You're getting
interesting
angry
because
Goodreads
yours is
reviews.
like
Yeah.
history that's like there's
Yours
no
is-
one who lived through that
Yes.
who's alive.
Right.
Whereas the two of
Yours
you are
is
writing
far
about
enough
much
that someone
more.
can't be like, well, when I was talking to Lincoln.
Yeah,
He
right.
never wrote in
Lincoln
this kind of pen.
only drank tea on Tuesdays. I'm sorry.
Right.
Well, and that's
Exactly.
why I'm so obsessed about all the primary source materials, because I feel like we've had these filters of hundreds of years of historians that have been like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, no, that's not what it meant. But no, read it
Yeah.
yourself. It's amazing.
And when someone's an iconic figure, a person that for so much, this is a horrible analogy, but people, Star Wars, people think Star Wars is something it's not because they've had 35 years to love it. So when it changes, so when you have an iconic figure that is beloved and there's marble statues and they overprotect something that
Oh, for
maybe
sure.
That's true.
Well,
Absolutely.
I mean,
Let go.
everyone on this panel has already gotten into this, but history is so straight washed.
Right.
I remember the first time I had gay friends, they would be like, this person's actually gay, and this person's actually gay, and I was like, you want everything to be gay, but it turns out everything is gay. A lot of things are gay, and
Yeah.
we're just not taught that. And when, like you
Yes.
said, when you start actually diving into these, actual histories, you're like, oh,
Right.
like we have been fed lies.
Right.
And in fact, I have my
Absolutely.
character at one point be like, well, like someone's arguing with them, and they're like, well, you can't just imagine everyone in history is straight and everyone in history is gay. And he's like, well, how can you imagine everyone in history is straight? We know that's just equally as improbable.
Right.
Yes.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah,
really
of
true.
course. Of course.
Right.
So, we're all writing for teens today, no matter if we're writing about now or writing about the past. So, what do you think today's teens are going to get out of, the time period that you're covering in your book?
Well, I mean, I've been on this recent tour. I've been going to lots of schools on this tour and meeting lots of young people, and they're, and luckily I've actually been going to states like that mandate queer history be taught in their schools. There's only 4 states that allow it right now, and that's California, Colorado, New Jersey, and Illinois was the most recent one that changed it. So,
Wow.
yeah.
And
Not the
Lincoln.
list I would have expected.
Out of
Yeah.
curiosity, do you
Yeah.
know what that means? Queer history taught in schools, like what part
So
of queer
they're
history? in what-
trying to figure that out still.
Right, 'cause
so
that's a big question,
It's a huge
right?
question.
Like,
That's
what does that
why
mean?
when it passed in 2011 here, they still haven't implemented yet because they're
Yeah.
still trying to figure out exactly what that means and how to implement it. And I think with Colorado, for instance, like when they found out I was coming, they're like, "Oh, somebody's teaching queer history. Go!" Like it's just like leeching on to whoever can do it, basically. But also, there in Colorado, they're teaching queer lit right now, which I think is really interesting. And
For high school level? Yeah.
yeah, and there's another class that's something similar to that. I can't remember the name of it now, but they're figuring out ways to incorporate learning about figures in queer history, but also moments in queer history that aren't talked about. Like we're talking about ACT UP movements that people don't talk about in high school, or this moment that I talk about in '73 about when being gay was a mental illness. Young people didn't know that, you
Yeah.
know? So to know, what I've learned from them is that they're so socially justice aware right now, and so open to discussion about where all of us came from, and all of us, like not just one us, but all of us. Like I've noticed that that's been a tremendous thing that's been kind of overwhelming to me, actually, because I didn't necessarily expect that, because it wasn't like that when I was in high school at all. Like it was one way and that was it, and we didn't talk gay stuff at all. Like that was just not a thing. So to see them so open and talking so openly together, like at one point I asked if you knew what the Stonewall riots were, and a kid who identified as straight, and because this was a social justice class, he actually raised his hand and asked a kid who identified as transgender if it was okay if he answered this question. And I was like, what?
That's
Yes,
amazing.
that's amazing, right? Like this is what was so fun to be a part of and witness, like this change that's happened.
Yeah.
Like, like, that they're even recognizing that with each other is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's what I have to say about that. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. There was like a moment of frustration for me, but I thought it was so awesome. Somebody on Twitter said something like, "Don't worry, I'm gonna write a sad gay book. I'm sick of all these happy gay books." And it was like, oh, you think that that's all you've had? That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because I wrote a happy queer book because I was so like, oh, everything's sad.
Yeah, right,
And I'm like,
exactly.
oh, they got a chance to grow up when they thought that was the most normal, boring
Right,
thing.
right.
Like, what a change in perspective.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
not
that's
even
really
that much
funny.
later. And I mean, part of me was like, oh, read a history book. But then the rest, and I'm like, I don't read history. Like,
Yeah.
it made me really
That's
excited
funny,
to know that
actually.
young people are in a world where they think, you know, all queer art is just so
Happy
frivolous.
and
They want to
like-
get into
Right,
like the
that's
meat
really
of it.
interesting.
Wow, that is interesting.
That's really interesting.
So I mean, I think it's.
I mean,
I think it's a great thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also about like when you learn about your history, whatever that means, your queer history, your history as a human being, your history in this country, whatever it is, like I say something, I think, I don't know if I say any authors know, but whatever, but I made this like as I was writing the book, and I realized that like it wasn't going to be quite as sad. I mean, it's a very sad book.
It's
because
pretty
of the-
sad.
Is it? But see, the thing is, when I think of the book, I think of it as like deeply hopeful because so much of it is about love and community and showing up for each other, and like
Definitely.
that's what surprised me when I was writing it. Because when I first started writing it, I'm like, oh god, this book is gonna be so sad because it was really revisiting like one of the most traumatic times of my life and history. And then as I was writing it, I realized like so much of it was about celebrating the sense of community, the sense of love, the people who came together, and the art, you know, the people who stood up, and it suddenly I had this kind of mission, which was like, this is about like celebrating the best of history, not the worst of it. And like, you know, we always say like history repeats itself, and it's like this warning about bad things, but it's like good history can repeat itself. Like, and so I feel like for young people who are searching for, you know, answers, it's like a confusing time. We, you know, literally have like a criminal president, like, you know, who's doing horrible things to huge communities of people, you know, name a community, probably for being targeted. It's like, but it's like, you know, why aren't we teaching them about ACT UP? Like, one of the most successful groups that, you know, took a marginalized community that was literally being left to die by governments around the world, by families, like, and they came together to create real meaningful change in a loving, you know, rageful, beautiful way. And that should be taught. And so, I mean, that was very exciting to me. And then also, I just think like a lot, and this is why I asked, like, I'm very curious if they're going to start introducing gay curriculums, because I feel like a lot of times, like, I know with my book, a lot of people who want to, like, teachers or adults are like, oh, it deals with sex a lot, or there's quite a bit of gay sex in my book. And like, I think it is very important. Like, usually when people ask me that, I try and like, as non-tersely as I can to say like, this whole book is about trying to eradicate shame from our community. And if you are even going to ask that question, it's implying that there's some kind of shame in exposing gay sex to teenagers and having them read about it. So it's like, I think for me, it's very important to like, this book is about, like, I felt like there was so much stigma around sex growing up, and it's about sending a message that like, we cannot equate sex with shame. We can't make young people feel ashamed.
Well, there's books
their
that have
sexuality.
more graphic heterosexual sex
Oh,
in
of
them
course.
that kids are
Of
given
course.
every day, and
Of
that's
course.
it would
Of
be,
course.
you know, if someone was like, but we would never let them read a straight sex books like that, I'd be like, fine, but that's
Right.
not what's happening.
No.
Right.
And I'm sure we've all experienced the idea of like having our content that is maybe not that graphic, maybe, or whatever, the matching heterosexual version of that is presented to young people as like, this is fine.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Like even like a TV show with a you know, a boy and a girl kissing is G, but a TV show with a boy and a boy kissing is PG-13
For sure.
or
Absolutely.
for mature audiences or whatever that's.
TVMA.
TVMA. Well,
FX.
something that I've been talking a lot
Yes.
about when I go to schools is this idea that language is really important, and that the lens we use to look at history is kind of wrong. When I talk about Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Fry Speed, people are like, well, prove it. You know, show me the DNA evidence.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's like, I don't, like, they want me to prove that they had sex, and then
Right.
that will prove to them
That's the
that
identifying.
that was it.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Right.
I don't think we're looking for proof of sex. I think we're looking to see who loved whom in history.
Yeah.
Because first of all, it's less prurient, and second of all, it's more interesting, and third of all, we can actually prove it because we have the primary source material. So I think the word homosexual is not helping our community. And I think that if we focused on love rather than sex, because our society is still so puritanical, and not to be sex negative, but if we uncoupled the idea of that for the majority culture, when they think of queer people, they think, oh, they're queer because they have sex in weird ways, or in different ways than I do. And I think that that's problematic. And if we were talking about love rather than sex, if it was homo-lovual history or homo-lovual rights that we were fighting for, I think it might be a different cultural conversation about that.
I go back and forth a lot on this myself, because I think there is something really screwed up about the way mainstream culture sees queer people as like over-sexualized some way, that like that's what it's about sex, it's about just some sort of gratuitous notion of it, something perverted. But I also don't want there to be, like Abdi said, I really don't want this shame around sex. And I think, you know, straight people can talk about hookup culture and about just, you know, wanting someone for the sake of wanting. And it's like queer people should have that freedom, that their rights aren't impinged upon just because they're like...
Yeah, and it is heterosexual. I mean, I see your point. It's a hard one. This is like a tricky one, because a part of me is like, yes, and wants it cheered on. And another part of me is like, but we also say heterosexual, and we don't think of straight people as solely defined by sex. And I feel like, as a gay man who's about to get married and has 2 kids, like, who very much I feel like, you know, fits like the happy heteronormative version of gay life that people want, like, I don't think that that's who I am. Like, I very much consider myself like, you know, a rebellious person who connects to the part of queer culture that is about, you know, standing apart from heteronormativity. So like, it's a very hard thing. Like, how do you both, I think we want to do what you are saying while still, I think, not, I don't know, not taking away
maybe we
piece of
add
our
it.
identity.
It's like the improv thing, right? Like yes and.
It's a yes and
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. Because I don't know what the happy medium is, and I think it's hard to create. I mean, this is why I personally use the word queer, because I think it's very like, and some people hate it. I have a lesbian friend who hates it.
Yeah,
and like you know, for me it feels very inclusive of the whole community, which right now is becoming so much more diverse in terms of how people self-identify. So I like that, and also it takes out the homosexual. It takes out. It's like it's queer.
Yeah,
it's all. You could be a man, a woman. You could be.
And what you're
gay,
doing
lesbian,
is
trans, it's just...
You're owning the word again. You're owning the word that used to be derogatory and is now being reclaimed as a positive, which I think is super important. And that's the thing, what could happen with what you're talking about with homosexuality could be, if it is as a negative.
It is like a clinical sounding
Like,
term. Like when I hear other people say it, I'm like, oh.
I mean, look, I would never describe myself as a homosexual. I would either say I'm queer or I'm
homo
gay.
or something.
I mean,
maybe I'd say I'm a mo.
I talk often that I didn't. I think one reason I didn't come out like as bi, I would be like, well, you know, I have a lot of possibilities. So I would like dance all around it, but I'm like, that word is so sexualized, and as like a person who grew up very Catholic, like don't talk about sex ever. It was I was like, that's not me. And then the more I thought, like, you're putting other people have put that on that word. That word does not mean like over sexualized. It's just a descriptor, not a slur, not a you know. And I got more comfortable with it, and I've been trying hard to like use it more, just to be like, you don't have to let a bigot's understanding of something define what it is.
Exactly.
That said, I'm so much more comfortable in a community just using the word queer as well. And I also feel like, great, we're all included now. We can just have these same conversations.
I know, but it's also because I feel like conversations like these happen all the time in the queer community. Even to discuss the over-sexualization, I always feel like, well, what about the members of our community who are healthily over-sexualized?
Yes.
Like, it's very, I feel like as
true.
we're discussing this language, like, we don't want to be sending, like, you know, messages to the parts of our community that we don't, you know, that somehow we don't want them. It reminds me a little bit of like when I was growing up. I remember there was like a lot of, you know, queer people would not want, you know, like for example, like an effeminate gay man when I was growing up was like at a parade or on TV, it would always be like, oh, why is that person representing our community? And it's like, well, what are we saying to like the effeminate gay man, that they're somehow less than? It's like, I just feel like we have to find ways of, you know, embracing everyone in the community, no matter who they are or how they want to live.
Well, and I think that's
you know.
definitely happening. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the shift is incredible to watch, especially in the young people, because and they're like, we went around a circle in one of these groups at one point, and you always introduce your name and your pronouns, right? And I'm telling you, almost every single one of them, just looking at them, identified as a different pronoun than I would have thought they would have identified as. Like that was so amazing that they're embracing that as part of their ways of discovering who they are and exploring who they are.
And what a gift to grow up like that.
Exactly.
As opposed to,
Being told who you are before you have time to
that's
figure
the
it out.
power
Exactly.
of these, not just your books, but that's the power of this community now rising to, it's normal.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Amy, we have time for one more question.
Great. So, do you guys want to talk about setting or music? Okay, great. Abdi, I did refer to your book once as Madonna propaganda.
A phrase I have
It is
repeated
such, yeah.
countless times since.
Obviously,
Not
the
a bad
other,
thing
the
at
other
all.
book literally has the name Ziggy Stardust in it. So,
Yeah.
like, we are talking about some serious music books,
Yeah.
less so for Lincoln.
Yeah.
I'm sure Lincoln would have appreciated the music of both Madonna
Oh
and
my God.
David Bowie had he had an opportunity.
Please.
But I'd love to hear from the two of you.
I mean,
Two things, just
Life
how
and
how
emancipation.
those artists really informed not just the characters but the books you were writing, and also, you can't. A book is a printed thing that you are reading. You can't actually have music in it. How did you? But I thought both of you did. There were things about it that I felt those artists within your words, your characters. How did you sort of figure out ways to infuse music into the written word?
The soul of it. The soul.
You want me?
he
you want me-
answered.
I know.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Wow. So Ziggy Stardust. So Ziggy Stardust was huge in 1973. It was like, and actually, he retired. David Bowie retired Ziggy Stardust in July of 1973. That was his last performance he did of this character he created. But he created this alter ego character that was absolutely revolutionary for the time. It was not happening. It was super glam rock, but he created this bisexual alien rock star who comes down from the heavens to save all the lost children of the world, and then they all gnaw and gnash at him and take everything from him, and he obliterates into stardust to sprinkle down from the heavens for all eternity. And that's like the character of Ziggy Stardust, which I thought was such a beautiful metaphor for the book and Jonathan's journey and what he's going through. And because he was so unapologetically himself on stage, and kind of just redefined that generation for creating this androgynous look that was not happening, that he was the pioneer in that. And it opened a lot of young people's eyes to enormous possibility of exploring their own sexuality. So it was, to me, it was such an important element to have Ziggy Stardust as Jonathan's Messiah, which he is, and because a lot of people worshipped David Bowie at that time for what he was doing, because he saw them. He actually saw them for who they were.
He was all of the above. He was
totally
not A or B.
And I think I just immersed myself in the music. I became obsessed myself with Ziggy Stardust and David Bowie, so it was easy to just slide
Were you
into.
not already obsessed
No.
with? Oh,
That's
wow.
very interesting. I assumed you were.
I assumed you were too. I'm really obsessed with David
will
Bowie.
say
so
also,
I
will-
Oh yeah.
I will-
I
You
am
know, I'm
now.
like a David Bowie. Yes.
Yeah.
I should say
Oh, I
because
didn't wear my David. I
I
have
always
a
thought
T-shirt
you
of
might.
Madonna's. Oh, I can't believe I didn't wear it. It's because
I
I
know.
came straight from work. I have a T-shirt that's like an illustration of Madonna with the Bowie.
I
Oh my
know.
God.
I thought
That's
you
the
were
most
totally
you
right.
shirt I can
Yeah,
imagine.
I
That's
know.
really good.
I have to
It's
give
a
a shout out
rebel
now because
heart
if I
shirt.
don't, it'll somehow get back to her. But my mom does have a dog named Ziggy Stardust, so I felt like I had to give him a shout out.
Of course.
That's
She
you
wanted to
do.
name him David
Amazing.
Bowie, and my dad was like, "No, that's weird,"
That's so
because he had like a
interesting.
shock of blonde hair when they got him,
Oh, I love
and so
it.
they compromised on Ziggy Stardust.
Amazing.
So
That is
anyway,
amazing.
That's amazing.
shout out to Ziggy Stardust.
I've
the
actually
Yorkie.
heard that quite a bit since the book came out.
Really?
A lot of pets are named
I
Ziggy
Yeah,
love
Stardust
actually,
that.
one of
in
my
the world.
best friends had a dog named Ziggy. Yeah.
It's a
Yes.
good one.
I mean, the interesting thing is Bowie was probably the biggest influence on Madonna. Like, she often cites him as, her biggest influence. I believe it was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame where she inducted him and gave him a big speech. I mean, they're very much like, of of a line.
They make queer
Yeah.
culture mainstream.
They make queer
which is
culture
incredible.
mainstream. They were really more. I mean, I think of them as performance artists more than I do as like, you know. I mean, they're musicians, they're video artists, they're so many things. But really, they were like, they're performative, and that they're experimenting with persona, which to me, like, and my book deals with this a lot. Like, growing up, maybe it's different for queer kids now, but growing up queer when we were queer, where you really had to be closeted at least. My community, like, you were very much learning, you know, the art of performance in that you had to like have a public face, you know, and a private. And I felt like, you know, to recognize that in art, like I was always obsessed with old Hollywood, with Madonna, with like, there was something about like performative culture where you felt, you know, which is one thing I always loved about Madonna, you feel that beneath the artifice there's a lot happening, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, and also just like the championing of queer culture at a time before, I mean, other than Elizabeth Taylor, who was really like not at the peak of her career, it was like at a post-career phase. Like Madonna was the only person in her prime willing to take that risk when, you know.
She was shattering everything
yeah,
she could.
It was, and I mean, she really, people don't give her credit because people are always like, you know, there's this, I think when people want to take her down, it's like, oh, she's an opportunist, she's a businesswoman. It's like, she literally like did nothing but champion queer culture at a time when like
I love the
people
idea
were being
that like
she could, her whole career could have ended.
I was
Like,
gonna
the
say I love the
mainstream
idea
kind
of like, oh, queer culture,
it's
that's
like,
how you get to
yeah,
the number
that's
one
how,
on this.
in,
Like,
in 1989.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I don't know, but in terms of writing the music, that was like one of the most fun things because it's just, it's so, the music is so alive in me, like to be able to describe what it felt like to first hear that music, to be able to describe what it feels like to be like, you know, when I went to see Blonde Ambition, I was 13 or 14, like, you know, to be able to describe what that, the impact that a concert has like that when you're young, you know, I mean, they still do on me now, but when you're young, it's like you're seeing a version of life that is different than what you experience. You're like, oh, that's where I want to live when I'm a grown up.
Also,
you know?
that's a piece of history.
Oh, for sure.
Where music has really changed now.
Definitely.
Yeah.
As a business, but also.
In what way?
I think it's disappearing, and that the originality of an individual that is not just with music. I mean, you could create a character or persona, right? But her music was also.
I think it's still there.
I think it's still there. I mean, I think there are artists like on the grand scale that give people that, and on like I have to say, like I'm a big like just as one example. Oh, I mean on the grand scale.
No, I mean
I mean, on one artist I'm really obsessed with is Lana Del Rey, and I feel like she very much like, I mean, she's got all the sad gays love Lana Del Rey, obviously. So she's in the long line. If you're like a Tori Amos fan, you just get like funneled in, you know. But like, you know, I go to her concerts and young people are all like wearing their little you know, their like flower things for her, and she very much creates a language in her music, and it points people to the past, and it's like, I feel like she's giving young people something special.
And I think we're a
Beyonce
few years
is
past
doing
her
it.
peak, but Gaga as well.
Gaga,
and
for
she'll come back.
sure.
She'll cycle back in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Beyonce, Rihanna. I mean, there's people, but it's.
I think.
Yeah.
And for me too, growing up, music was my safe space for sure. It was the time where I could escape into my own self without being disrupted, and that was why it was so important to include in the book for me. It's like, I think music has a way of unlocking, you know, doors in our souls we're too scared to open ourselves. And I think when you find someone you really attach to musically, and it just shatters something within you, it's like it's opening the Pandora's box. It allows you to see something more about yourself you weren't allowed to see.
Yeah, it makes
before.
you feel seen.
Exactly.
All right, I think we have to wrap up.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for coming,
Thank
our
you.
little group. We love you.
It was awesome.
Thanks
Thank
to
you
Angela.
for
Thank you
moderating
for your
us.
question.
You were
Of course,
amazing.
thanks everyone for being so thoughtful with your
Yay.
answers.
Yes.
Our books are up front, except for poor Lee. If you want to get Lee's book, they can order it for you, or you can talk to Lee. He's got other ways to get it. That sounds like black markety. I didn't mean that. I just mean he's got a website that if you want to go home and order it later, that's cool too.
Yeah.
But they'll help you now. So thank you everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Thanks, Lambda Literary and BookSoup.